But a big hello to our Highlights Foundation family. We're so happy to have you here with us this afternoon. For those that may not know me, I am Kat Galliano. My pronouns are she, her. I am the social media manager here at the Highlights Foundation, joining you from the traditional lands of the Siwanoy people, which is Westchester, New York. Apart from all the fun things I get to do at the Highlights Foundation, I am also a reader and a writer myself. So getting to talk to our faculty and friends is just so exciting to me because as I'm asking them questions, I'm also still learning very much. And I'm very excited to have Harold, our editor, Harold Underdown, here. And he will be teaching the upcoming two-night mini Practical Matters in Children's Book Publishing. But before we dive in, I just want to remind our viewers that joining in any Highlights Foundation spaces to do so with no hate, no harm, and no harassment of any kind. Now let's get started. Children's publishing, I feel like always seems to be in an interesting place. But what makes you think this is an interesting time?
This time in particular?
Yeah.
I mean, that that's such a great question because, you know, I feel like ever since I started working in the business, which was back in the previous century, that there's always been something happening. And many of those things just kind of add to the challenges for writers and illustrators getting started or trying to continue their careers. And, I can remember, for example, when publishing houses all started closing their doors and no longer looking at unsolicited submissions, and thereby created a whole new layer of having to submit to agents and artists reps to make contact with a publishing house. And now that's, except for interesting exceptions among smaller publishers, for example, that's kind of the routine, and we just accept that. In terms of what's new and different about now, I think there's differences and changes really in terms of both what creative people are doing and what publishers are doing. And what creative people are doing is working a lot harder on their craft and making sure that their writing and illustrating is really up to the standards that it needs to be. And that means there's just more competition. And for me, that's a wonderful thing because there's so much to look at and to consider and to be able to choose between. But for those who are trying to break through, it just increases that challenge of being noticed and of being selected once they're noticed. At the publishing end, I feel like this is just something that's been going on gradually through the history of publishing. Is publishers have sought to cut back and trim back and become more efficient. And what that often means is they're reducing the amount of time that staff can spend looking at submissions. And there's only so much you can do to kind of outsource that to agents. The agents now are acting like a kind of filter. But after they've done that filtering for us and said, look, we found the perfect thing for you, we still have to look at that and make a decision about it and say, oh yeah, this is the right thing for us. This is what we want to acquire. Or we still have to say, well, this needs further development, and here's some thoughts I have about that. So it's always going to be the worst of times. It's always going to be the worst of times. But certainly right now, you want to make sure not only that you're continually learning and growing and increasing your skills, but that you're doing everything you can to understand how the business works, what the best practices are, and so on. And so courses like Practical Matters or the more extensive crash course, I think are a really necessary part of that. And I've been speaking about these subjects for a long time.
As someone who is going to re-dip their toe into querying soon, I love getting to watch your courses and just learn because I feel like it's so foundational to just kind of go back to the basics to just learn and re-educate yourself on like all the other things going on because like I've been so focused on the manuscript and revising and getting it to my mentor and getting it back and working on the craft, but like
Mhm.
also things are happening on the outside that I'm just not paying attention to. So that's why I find Crash Course and particularly this mini so important, of just like getting back into the basics, which sort of leads into my second question, which we kind of already mentioned that you also teach Crash Course, which is a multi-week course. But this Practical Matters is a mini, and it's essentially a distilled version of Crash Course.
Mhm.
And so, what's the most gratifying part about teaching this kind of intro to kid lit class?
Mhm. What's the most gratifying about it isn't necessarily someone asking a question and me being able to answer it right at the moment of the
Mm-hmm.
course. It's it's what I hear later.
Mm-hmm.
It can be years and years later that people who've taken the crash course, or you know back in the day I was giving workshops like this in person, like at local SCBWI conferences or out at the Highlights Foundation campus, and people I met, they, they would come back to me and they'd say, what you told me about um, how to put together a query letter, or what I learned about the submissions process, or some of those details about how a contract works. Those were really useful for me, and I really, I appreciate you having told me that. And that's how I know that there's a need for a course like this, which is different from a lot of the necessary courses on the craft. You certainly need the craft. There are a lot of great courses available. You should be availing yourself of those. But um, I just I find it really satisfying to reflect on what the things are that people need to know, and really work to provide those in a kind of in a compact and organized way.
Yeah, because if you think about it, like for me, I mostly consider myself a creative. So things like contracts are just such foreign concepts.
Mhm.
So whenever I dip back into into either your mini or the crash course, it just like refreshes, oh, things that I just am not thinking about at all through the writing and revising process. So I completely agree with you on the importance of this and taking the refresher class if you've already taken it before, or taking the mini because that's just like a bite size of all the things that you need to remember. So whether you are seasoned or you're new, I do feel like this is important to kind of refresh yourself, um, because it's important because we're a little on the artistic side, so it's good to remember the other side of the business, which essentially is the thing that we forget. It is a business,
Yeah.
so
And you mentioned something that reminds me of a point that I want to make, which is when it comes to contracts,
mhm,
that you might think, as someone who is probably going to be working with an agent if you aren't already, oh well, I can leave the contracts up
right.
to my. But I would tell anybody, you you don't want to leave it up to your agent. You want to
Right.
make sure that you understand what you're signing, and if that means asking your agent to explain it to you,
Mhm,
that's part of their job. But there are things you can learn in advance just about the way a publishing
mhm.
contract, and that's one of the things I go into.
Yes, and as someone who has, like I mentioned, audited this class, I highly, 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 and monitored, highly recommend you take it just so you can understand some basics, because ultimately we are thinking about the either the writing part or the illustrating part, but again, can't stress enough the importance of remembering the business side too. So my last question to you is, why is it important now more than ever to have a foundational understanding of the industry before you start querying, submitting, or any else kind of like diving right into the business?
Well, if you don't have that understanding, you're not necessarily going to be going about it the right way. I mean, that's what
Mhm.
it comes, and that applies both in terms of like how you how you write the query letter, the structure of it, the information you include, and also how you go about deciding who to send it to. Um, and it's very easy to beat your head against a wall sending a submission to a company that doesn't publish that kind of book or an
Mhm.
agent that doesn't represent that kind of book. And that's, you know, that's just one example of the kind of thing you need to both know that it's something you need to figure out and how you can figure it out, where you can do the research, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because you don't want to make silly mistakes at the beginning and your query not even get looked at, for example, or jump the gun and like think your manuscript is perfect when truly you're probably the only one who's looked at it. So it's like it's important to educate yourself on, like I keep mentioning, on the business side of things, so that way you have the strongest possibility to be seen. And then, every level after that with an agent and then getting a contract and then getting published. So it's just important to have that foundation, and I think that's what you do so beautifully with these courses, especially in the mini, which is just like the bite-sized version of the crash course, of just understanding that and how important it is to have that base. Like anything else, when you're learning something new or starting something fresh, it's important to have that foundational start before you dive into it, so you're not just kind of waddling in no direction. You're at least understanding and moving towards the greater goal.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Well, that's the last question from me. If anyone else has questions, we have a couple minutes left. I just see a lot of love and a lot of hello. We have someone tuning in from Pakistan. Welcome. That is so far away and so amazing. Hi, Molly. um, yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type that in now. And if not, we're gonna wrap this up. And I don't see any questions coming through. So I'm gonna have to say goodbye to my friend Harold.
Mm-hmm. Thank, thanks, Kat. It's been good talking with you.
So if you would like to join Harold for Practical Matters in Children's Book Publishing, please run over to our website and register, highlightsfoundation.org. This kicks off next week. And thank you, Harold, for joining me and for chatting with me. It's always a pleasure to pick your head on some really exciting questions about the courses you're teaching. So as always, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.